We're on the last lap right now. It's a very good lap, actually. So the final session is called New York Municipalities Understanding and Managing Fiscal Stress. And we have some very interesting and diverse papers here. A couple of them are dealing with some of the basic economic problems. We have John Bacheller is doing the poverty in upstate New York City's social and economic impacts, where he's going to be including a discussion of poverty and economic and educational outcomes. We will also have a paper on New York's continuing foreclosure problem. Susan VanDeventer, the Office of New York State Comptroller, will be presenting that. And that, interestingly, talks about the housing developments, but also looks at some of the policies and how they interact with the economy as well. We have a good paper on the social and fiscal consequences of urban decline, evidence from large American cities, 1980-2010, which looks at a much larger sample of cities by Michael Manville and Daniel Kuhlmann of Cornell Universities, and that really looks at the dynamic relationships between population changes on the one hand and things like fiscal capacity and social economic stress on the other. And finally, we're also looking at understanding austerity, state and local responses since the Great Recession by Yunji Kim and Mildred Warner of Cornell University. So we're going to actually start with that last one with Yunji and look at the understanding austerity, state and local responses since the Great Recession. Yunji is a PhD student from the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University.
Thank you. They were the right file. Great. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Yunji Kim, and I'm a PhD student at Cornell University. And today my talk is going to pull from a couple of different research projects that have been conducted by our team under the direction of Dr. Mildred Warner. And what we're trying to do as a team here is to understand austerity. And we're looking at both the state and local government responses since the Great Recession. There are three parts to my presentation, and I'm going to start with the broad and move to the narrow. So I'm going to start you up with the big ideas of what's going on in terms of local government responses to the fiscal stress since the Great Recession. And then I'm going to take you down and ground you a little bit with a national data set looking at, well, what are local governments across the U.S. doing in terms of service delivery after the Great Recession? And then lastly, I'm going to talk about New York State, narrowing it down to our state and looking at, well, how do we understand austerity within New York State? And I'm going to suggest that in New York State, we need to think about state-level austerity. All right, so let's start with the big ideas. There's a lot of discussion about what is going on in terms of local government service delivery since the Great Recession. And there's a big debate going on in the scholarly literature. And I'm going to start you off with the more depressing view, and that's the left-hand column on this table. And that's what we call the austerity urbanism view. And I want you to think about Detroit when I'm telling you about this viewpoint. So this is the viewpoint that says local governments are political creatures who are feeling the fiscal stress and that they're cutting and privatizing services while ignoring community needs. These scholars are particularly worried about the turn that cities are making in terms of gathering more revenue sources, and that particularly they're charging more user fees. And they're worried about this because of equity and ability to pay issues. And then lastly, they're worried about local governments becoming more anti-union because they're having to cut personnel. And in order to do that, they want to try to get around the collective bargaining rights. Now I'm going to move to a little bit more positive view, and that's the view that we're arguing for, called pragmatic municipalism. And we're arguing that local governments are able to balance need, finance, and service responsibilities, and that they do respond to community needs within their constraints. We're arguing that local government managers are aware that there are a variety of ways to deliver services in cheaper ways. It's not just about privatization. They know that there is another tool called intermunicipal cooperation or service sharing, and that they use both of these tools. And then next, that in terms of bringing in new revenue sources, they're not just turning to user fees, but that they're looking at a variety of revenue tools. And this can include things like hotel occupancy taxes or payment in lieu of taxes or tax increment financing. And then lastly, that local government managers have dealt with union pressures for a long time, and that they are able to manage these union pressures. So now I'm going to move on to the second part of my presentation, which is giving you the national view of what's going on. And this is where we use a national data set of local governments to test these two ideas. So which one describes the way that local governments are reacting? And we're doing this by using a regression analysis to look at how stress, capacity, need, and place characteristics are impacting service provision. So this is a number of services that local governments are delivering and the way that they're delivering these services. And we're looking at the three most popular ways that local governments deliver services, and that's first the direct public way. This is the traditional public way, and then second is privatization, and third is intermunicipal cooperation. The data that we're using, the most important source of our data, is a national survey of local governments that we conducted in 2012 with the ICMA. And this is a survey that asked local government managers how many services they're delivering. We provide a list of 76 services, and local government managers can check, yes, we currently provide this, or no, we no longer provide, or no, we've never provided. And then for each of these 76 services, they check how they deliver these services. And then we also combine this data with American Community Survey data, Census of Governments, and our final data set includes 1,580 municipalities. So here are the model variables that we use. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just want to draw your attention to the ones marked in red. And I'll start with the first one that's under the stress category, and that's the first one is home value decrease. And this is looking at the change in median home value of all municipalities from the period before the Great Recession and after. And then the next two variables, I'm going to move you over to the capacity category, and that's user fees and other revenue sources. I'm going to talk about these together because they come from the same question in our survey, where we gave local government managers a list of 13 ways of raising revenues, and we asked them to check all of the tools that they are using right now. Now, we pull out the user fees as a variable on its own because the people who argue that local governments have become austerity machines are always using the user fees as an example. And then we aggregate the rest of the 12 tools. And then lastly, we looked at the impact of unionization rate. This also comes from our national survey. And we asked local governments what percentage of your employees are covered by collective bargaining rights. And there were 4 categories. The lowest one was less than 10%. The next goes from 10 to 29%. And then the highest category is more than 50%. So let's move on to the results. What do we find? At a national level, we find that places that are under more stress do provide fewer services. They also do more privatization. So now you're thinking, okay, this sounds a little bit similar to the austerity urbanism viewpoint. But what we also find is that places that are under more stress are also using more cooperation. So we're arguing that local government managers are relying on their previous knowledge of how to manage and effectively deliver services, and they're using both privatization and cooperation to continue to deliver services under stress. Next, we look at revenue capacity. This is the other revenue sources variable that we used. And we find that places that use more alternative revenue sources as a tool are providing more services. They are doing both more privatization and more cooperation. So innovation in terms of revenue sources is linked with innovation in terms of service delivery. And these are the things that allow local governments to continue to deliver services. Lastly, we find that unionization is linked to more services being delivered and higher rates of privatization. So unions are not standing in the way of service innovation, but less or lower levels of cooperation. And this may be due to the differences in union contracts between municipalities. So to conclude the second part of the national view, we find that austerity urbanism is a too narrow of a view to describe what local governments across the U.S. are doing after the Great Recession. Instead, we find that local governments are practicing pragmatic municipalism using both revenue side innovation as well as service delivery innovation to continue to fulfill their public role. So now I'm going to move on to the last part of my presentation, taking you down to the New York State level. And we're asking, well, why would local governments starve themselves? This argument that austerity urbanists are proposing just didn't make sense to us. In New York State, we see that property taxes and expenditures have been flat for the past decade. And instead, we thought, well, perhaps this is an austerity machine at the state level. A state austerity machine would limit local authority. An example of this could be the tax cap, or cut state aid and have high levels of decentralization. So in order to understand what's going on in New York State, our research team under Dr. Mildred Warner's direction have been going around upstate New York conducting focus groups with local government officials. So this is looking at the average property taxes of local governments in New York State from 2003 to 2013. These are divided by different types of local governments. So the top line is counties, and then cities without New York City, since New York City doesn't have a tax cap, and then towns and villages. And what we're seeing is that average property taxes for the past decade have largely been flat. Next, this is looking at the average expenditures of local governments in New York State. And again, this is a similar picture. The average expenditures since the past decade have been flat. Now we look at the idea of the state austerity machine, and we see that average state aid in New York State has decreased for counties and especially for towns. And these are all in real terms. And then lastly, we find that fiscal decentralization is very high in New York State. And this is the amount of local government expenditure over state and local government expenditure. So what we're finding is that New York has the second highest level of decentralization, second only to the state of Nevada. So 64 cents of every dollar is spent at the local level. Now, if you look at the local share of education funding, New York State is number one. 82 cents of every dollar is spent at the local level for education expenditures. So to conclude, this is the part of our research project that's very much in progress. And what we're thinking is that the idea of state austerity urbanism, the idea of austerity urbanism really applies more to the state behavior. We're seeing more political behavior, perhaps less attuned to community needs, high levels of decentralization, and usurping local authority in the form of the tax cap. And we're not sure about the promoting innovation. We talked a lot about how the state is trying to promote innovation in terms of service sharing, but we've also found in a survey that we conducted in 2013 that local governments in New York State have been sharing services for a very long time. So if this is not something new, how much of that is innovation? We're not sure. And we think that the behavior of local governments in New York State is more aptly described as pragmatic municipalism. What we're seeing is that local government officials are trying to balance community need, the need to balance their books, and their service responsibilities. and that they're using innovation both in terms of surface sharing and alternative revenue sources within their constraints. And lastly, we see that they are managing the union pressures. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Yunji. And now we're going to have Susan VanDeventer from the Office of the New York State Comptroller's Office. And she's a member of the research unit at the Division of Local Government and School Accountability for the State Comptroller's Office. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to participate in this conference. We are specialized in local government research and policy making, and so it's very nice to have a whole conference devoted to that topic. It's not something we see very often. So, but I know the. Well, thanks. So let's see. Here's my clicker, and it goes this way. All right. So foreclosure is an area that we look at periodically. We look at all kinds of issues, and in August, we presented a brief snapshot that looked just at kind of just very briefly at levels of foreclosure activity in New York State. And currently, we're working on a little longer piece that we'll talk a little bit more about. Why is this problem still a problem all these years after the recession, and what actions are being taken to address it? So I'm going to give you a little bit of both papers. So the foreclosure problem is still with us. This topic came to us kind of from upstairs in the building. And so when it first came to us, I was thinking, is it still a problem all these years later? And yes, it is. The Mortgage Bankers Association does a quarterly survey, and they give state-level results. And 5.3% of the home mortgages in New York are in foreclosure. That's 1 in 20. That seems really amazing to me. We're the second highest in the nation, and only New Jersey has a higher rate of 7.3%. I also have some data from the Unified Court System showing the pending foreclosure caseload, and this chart shows from the beginning of 2013, roughly, until the beginning of 2015, so 2 years worth of data. And so we could see there was a 27% increase over the first year and a half there, till about mid-2014, and then since then it's leveled off a bit, but it's still quite high. And I have that at the county level, so I rolled that up kind of regionally to look at regional variation. And we can see that in New York City, which is the orange line there, the pending foreclosure caseload is dropping. It's gone down by nearly 10% over 2 years. And, but however, in the rest of the state, it's still going up. And in the downstate area, which would be Long Island and what we call the Mid-Hudson region, the area north of New York City, it's gone up 63% in 2 years. And in the rest of upstate, it's gone up 47%. So it's still a thing, and it's really a thing downstate. So I also looked at, just the number of pending foreclosure cases doesn't really tell you a lot about the prevalence. So I looked at it also as a percentage of housing units, and it's not an ideal measure because, foreclosures are based on loans, and one loan can be for a multi-unit dwelling, and also actually my numerator includes both commercial and residential foreclosures because I didn't have the data disaggregated, but commercial foreclosures are a small share of overall foreclosures. But still, this gives you a sense. On Long Island, this is data from the beginning of 2015. By this measure, 2.7% of there were foreclosures as a percentage of housing units was 2.7%. So that's like 1 in 38 housing units in foreclosure by this kind of rough proxy. And that's the highest in the state. The Mid-Hudson region is also a bit high. And in the rest of the state, it's mostly under 1%, except in the Capital District where it's 1.1. So again, this is a different way of looking at it, but it's still quite alarming. So then this next paper is more about, what's happening with respect to this problem, and why do we still have such a heavy pending caseload after all this time? And New York is a judicial foreclosure state, so that means that foreclosures are resolved through the court system. And that's a good thing in terms of due process, because then the borrowers and the financial institutions, have a chance to state their case before the courts. But at the same time, it does lengthen the process. All the research shows that judicial foreclosure takes a lot longer than the process in states that don't have a judicial foreclosure process. And then in New York, there have been some additional changes to the process that have served to lengthen it. And I only have time to talk about one of those. In 2009, they instituted settlement conferences, first for high-risk mortgages, but eventually the settlement conference step in the process was, it's mandatory now for almost all residential foreclosure cases. And so that basically meant that the borrower and the servicer, or the financial institution, are required to meet together to try and work out a solution, either a loan modification or some other kind of non-foreclosure outcome, before the case can be, proceed to foreclosure through the rest of the process. So that was that was intended to help borrowers keep their homes and make sure that they understood their rights and whatnot. But in effect, it also lengthens the process. And I had some data on what happened at these conferences, the outcomes of these conferences. So this is just a snapshot of what happened for cases that had a settlement conference during the first court term of 2015, which is roughly the month of January. So 8,667 cases had a settlement conference during that part of the court calendar. And the result for 2/3 of them was a continuance, which means they were going to have another settlement conference later. And only, not even 20% were disposed through the settlement conference. Like either they were settled, or they proceeded to default, or they were dismissed or discontinued. Most of them just go on to have another settlement conference. And so the average number of settlement conferences for an active case during that time period was 4, down from 7 2 years earlier. So most cases have multiple settlement conferences. And then the numbers I have are for ones that haven't all been resolved. So the ultimate number of settlement conferences to get to a disposition for all cases would be much higher, I would think. So there's this kind of like spin cycle that they go through. And the reasons for that are many and varied, because sometimes borrowers don't have all the right paperwork, or if they come really unprepared and not understanding their rights, sometimes the court staff will direct them to a housing counselor so that they come back more prepared next time. And then the process sometimes drags on so long that they may have all their paperwork in order, but now it's out of date and it has to be redone. So there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape that is, this process kind of exacerbates some of the red tape involved in the process, I think. So then it makes sense to look at, well, what happens when you have a long foreclosure process? What kind of outcomes do you get? And I don't have any state data to work from, so I looked at some national studies, and this one is a good study by Larry Cordell and Lauren Lambie-Hansen they're associated with one of the Federal Reserve banks, and they did a study where they looked at mortgage outcomes from a large sample of loans. And the light gray area, basically it shows you what happens to delinquent loans over time. So the time is running across the x-axis there. And then we start out with 100% delinquent loans. And then over time, some of them are cured. Those are the dark blue loans. That means they're paid off or otherwise made current. And then the orange is the foreclosures. And so some of them end up in being foreclosed, but that can take years. And then some of them are still delinquent after 5 years. And then the dark gray at the top are ones that they don't really know what happened to. They exited the sample. And this is my favorite chart, I think, because it tells a powerful story. And the story is that if you have a seriously delinquent loan, in the first year, there's a good chance that you can cure it and move on. Like 30% or so of the loans are cured in the first year. But after that, that curve flattens out. And so, if the process you can have a really long process, but that's not going to lead to better outcomes for borrowers necessarily. You're just going to kind of have a long slog to foreclosure. So then, since our focus is always the impact on local governments, how does this long foreclosure process affect local governments? And I have to say, foreclosure in and of itself doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on local governments. If the borrower stays in the home, which is their right, they can stay in the home through the foreclosure process. And if the taxes are paid, and from what I've understood by talking to people in various other agencies, servicers and financial institutions do tend to pay their property taxes even throughout the foreclosure process. And if the house is occupied and maintained, then the local government really shouldn't be too worried. But what does happen more often than we'd like is that properties become vacant before the foreclosure is complete. So these are the vacant, abandoned zombie properties, they're often called. And those are definitely a concern to local governments. And some of the negative externalities that we see are increased crime rates, lower property values and home sale values, and that can shrink the tax base a bit. And also higher costs for code enforcement, maintenance, and demolition. Now, usually local governments aren't responsible for maintenance and demolition and those costs. Those could be charged back to the servicers or the financial institutions. But if you don't know who they are, I think it can be hard to collect in some cases. And so local governments can incur those kinds of costs. And I should say that the research shows that increased crime rates and lower home sale values are true whether or not the property is vacant. So even with occupied properties, there is an effect on the surrounding community. So just briefly, what's happening is the courts are very concerned about the backlog and trying to reduce it. And they're also very concerned about borrowers' rights and making sure that they have access to representation at the settlement conferences and throughout the foreclosure process. So I think some of what we saw with the downtrend in New York City was really due to the courts taking action to reduce the caseload there. So I think there's hope that if they extend those efforts elsewhere, that maybe we'll see a drop in the foreclosure caseload over time. Also in May, the governor announced an agreement with major servicers and financial institutions about maintaining vacant, abandoned properties. So basically, the financial institutions, once a loan is delinquent, they have agreed, most of them, to go and check the status of the property, and if it's vacant, they agree to maintain it. And the Department of Financial Services will have a registry of vacant properties that they will share with municipal governments. So those are promising steps, but since the agreement with the financial institutions is voluntary, we'll have to see how that plays out. But I've only got a minute left. Okay, and then the last thing I want to talk about, actually this is good because this is where I was going to end anyways. Land banks are another strategy for dealing with the foreclosure crisis. It allows, land banks can acquire and dispose of distressed real property. And they're a new thing in New York. They're not new nationwide, but in New York, they were authorized by provisions in state law that were enacted in 2011. The state has authorized the creation of 20 land banks, and apparently about, I believe, a dozen or so have been created. And the Attorney General's office has awarded some grant funding of slightly less than $33 million for the land banks. And we are currently, one of my colleagues has gone around talking to the land bank people, and we will be publishing, we do plan to publish a report on the land banks in the coming months. I'm not sure how long that'll take. So they're a new thing, and we're excited to see what they're doing to help address this problem. They're not concerned just with foreclosures alone, but certainly that is one type of property that they can end up acquiring. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, our next speaker will be John Bacheller. John will be speaking about the poverty in the upstate economy, as well as the educational and social outcomes. John served as the Senior Vice President and Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Research at the Empire State Development, and he also worked with the New York State Senate and taught at Hamilton College. John?
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Institute for giving me the opportunity to present this paper. I'd also like to thank Meredith Barr-Andrucci, Kent Gardner, John Rodat, and Amy Schock for helping me with their time and insights. They all read an earlier version of the paper. Purposes of the study really are twofold. First, to examine the incidence of poverty in upstate New York cities and to compare it with the surrounding suburbs. The second piece of the paper looks at the relationship of the concentration of disadvantaged students to student performance and to evaluate New York's failing schools approach. Let's look first at the kind of state of upstate New York metropolitan areas. The point I want to make with this chart is that when you look at upstate and compare it with the Rust Belt, that the metropolitan areas as a whole in upstate are not doing badly. The average incomes in upstate metropolitan areas are a little higher than the Rust Belt average, with the exception of Utica. But when we look at median family incomes, we see a couple of interesting things. One is that when we look at the areas in the cities, mean family incomes are pretty low, with the exception of Albany. Mean family incomes are quite a bit below the national average. But when we look outside the cities, median family incomes are pretty high. The ratio of family incomes inside the cities to outside the cities is greater in upstate cities than it is for the Rust Belt average. In fact, in Rochester, the ratio is 2 to 1. The average family income is $48,000 in the city, $96,000 in the suburbs. When we look at the percentage of children in poverty, we see the same kind of pattern. When we look at the Rust Belt average, about 43% of families with children are in poverty in the cities. In the suburbs around those cities, the average is about 14%. When we look at upstate cities, we see kind of more extremes. Rochester has almost 1 in 2 families in poverty. In the suburbs, 9.4%. Syracuse, 49.2% of families with children in poverty, compared with 8.2% outside the city. So again, we see this kind of pattern of more families in poverty in upstate cities. Outside the cities, we see fewer families than the Rust Belt average. Poverty for all city residents increased by 5.1% from 1999 to 2013. Poverty for all residents in suburban areas increased by 2%. Poverty for families with children under 18 increased by 15.3% in that time period. In suburban areas, the increase was only 3%. And nationally, families with children in poverty increased by 7.7%. So you have this increasing gulf, this increasing economic segregation in our metropolitan areas, where the cities are getting poorer, the suburbs are really not. I want to turn to what impact this has. What's the meaningful impact of this on a particular way people live in the cities and in the suburbs. So what I looked at is data from the New York State Student Assessment of Performance for grades 3 to 8 for 2014 to 15. And what I did was compared it with the performance of the students on those tests with the percentage of disadvantaged students in the schools. And I applied a simple regression model to see what the strength of the relationship between poverty and educational performance was. Using regression analysis, I estimated the percentage of students who would be expected to pass at a school or school district based on the percentage of disadvantaged students. I found that the percentage of disadvantaged students in schools strongly predicts the percentage of students who pass the exam. In fact, 79% of variation in student performance between schools was explained by the concentration of poor students in the schools. So what it shows is that for an increase of 10% in the concentration of disadvantaged students, average student performance on the statewide assessment decreased by 6.3%. About 20% of variation in student performance is not explained by the concentration of disadvantaged students in these schools. Well, I also found that when you look at disadvantaged students compared with not disadvantaged students, that students who are not economically disadvantaged students benefit more from being in schools that have fewer disadvantaged students than students who are economically disadvantaged. But though poor students did not benefit as much from attending schools with fewer poor students, they still benefit, with only about 8% of poor students passing in schools with the highest concentration of poor students, compared with 31% at schools with the lowest concentration. Similar pattern exists for school districts. This is a plot of, This is a plot of school district performance. This is a regression line, and these are the actual school districts. Again, a very tightly scattered distribution around the regression line. If you look at the performance of school districts in upstate cities, we see some distinctive features. First, upstate city schools have high percentages of poor students. In Rochester, 92% of students in the public schools are poor by the measure that I used, while in Utica, 88% are poor, in Schenectady, 81% are poor, and in Syracuse, 79% are poor. Second, students in upstate city schools did not do well on the tests. In Rochester, only 6% of students received a passing grade on the statewide assessment. In Syracuse, only 9% passed. In the best performing school district, Utica, only 18% passed. Compare that with the performance in affluent suburban school districts such as Pittsford, where nearly 70% passed, and Fayetteville, Manlius, where 68% passed. But the performance of upstate school districts is close to what is predicted from the regression model. For example, in Rochester, 6% of students passed, while the model predicted that 7.1% would pass. 7% would pass. So you can see that here and here, 7.2. In Buffalo, 13% passed, while the model predicted 15% would pass. Only in Albany was student performance significantly below the level of performance predicted. Next, I turn to the State Education Department's list of failing schools. SED states, despite the fact that districts with failing schools receive more state funding than other districts, these schools are delivering unacceptable results. The statistics, in fact, contained in this report and its appendix expose a public education system badly in need of change. The governor's program includes a takeover of some of the failing schools and $100 million of capital assistance and program assistance for the schools. In upstate cities, 69 schools were on the failing schools list. All of them had more than 65% of their students classified as economically disadvantaged. And in fact, students at these schools did badly on the state assessment. Only 6% received a passing grade. Those schools are schools that are shown in the squares here. Those are the failing schools. They're all highly disadvantaged and they perform poorly. But the regression model predicted that only 9.8% would pass, a difference of less than 4%. Note also that the data showed that the performance of the schools labeled as failing was not significantly different from schools with the same percentage of poor students that weren't labeled as failing. Here's our 95% confidence intervals. All of the schools that were labeled as failing were within the confidence band. And if you look, many of the schools that were not labeled as failing performed as badly as the schools that were labeled as failing. So this is really not a good indicator of school performance relative to economic disadvantage. So the failing schools label stigmatizes schools for performance that largely reflects the socioeconomic condition of the students who attend them. The report attributes power to the schools that they do not have and risks alienating faculty and staff, damaging their reputations, and increasing public cynicism about the effectiveness of public schools. Since the report focuses on institutional changes to schools, such as state takeovers, as a solution to the work performance, it's not likely to succeed. Implications. Despite the large and growing concentration of people in poverty in upstate cities, New York lacks a focused strategy to address the problem. New York's focus on regional economic strategies for upstate New York is ill-suited to address central city poverty because it's not targeted to the needs of inner city residents. Effective approaches to central city poverty must prioritize remedies that directly address poverty in central cities. Among the issues that need to be addressed include low levels of education, lack of marketable skills, single-parent families, particularly child care challenges, transportation to workplaces, prevalence of part-time or no work, poor performance of students in schools, inadequacy of government cash and non-cash income support, and barriers to use of government assistance. Education is critical. Remedies must reflect the reality that school performance is strongly associated with the concentration of poverty. Alternative classroom strategies like those used in some successful no-excuses charter schools should be considered. Leaders should also consider whether one-size-fits-all approaches like Common Core and Race to the Top are appropriate for schools with high concentrations of disadvantaged students, and should European approaches such that emphasize vocational tracks be considered. The increasingly high levels of poverty found in upstate central cities, particularly in families with children, point to the need for a focused effort to reduce its impact on central city residents. Given the fact that upstate central cities are surrounded by relatively affluent suburban populations, the population may be virtually invisible to suburban residents. But poverty is increasingly prevalent in upstate cities and is isolating city residents from economic security and opportunity. The prevalence of single-parent families and parents with low levels of education in upstate central cities points to the need to develop support mechanisms for these families and children that encourage long-term goal-oriented behavior and remove obstacles to self-sufficiency. This also points to the need for family-centered dual-generation approaches as opposed to current policies that often focus on either children or parents. And we must recognize that in order to help the poor students who attend schools in upstate cities, we should not blame those schools for the weak performance of their students. Instead, it should address the problem with solutions that recognize the impact of poverty on student performance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have Daniel Kuhlmann will be, is it Daniel? Will be, okay. Will be presenting the last paper, The Social and Fiscal Consequences of Urban Decline, Evidence from Large American Cities. And Daniel is a PhD student at the Department of City and Regional Planning, also at Cornell University. And he's a graduate of Carleton College, where my son just started college. So anyway.
Well, thank you. And the paper that Mike and I have been working on, as the title might allude to, this is a little bit of a departure from some of the research you've seen today, partly because we're looking at large cities. We're looking exclusively at large cities and cities from across the country, so kind of outside of New York. But I think as the discussion after the last panel and some of the presentations have shown, fiscal stress is not just a central city problem, it's a regional problem. And certainly we can't expect that solutions to problems of fiscal stress can be solved by cities alone. It takes some sort of kind of intergovernmental cooperation to help cities that are kind of chronically fiscally stressed. So the questions we're trying to answer here, like the primary motivating question of this research is, what is the relationship between population loss and fiscal stress? So is fiscal stress just a consequence of population loss, or does fiscal stress actually cause kind of future iterations of population loss? And to really look at this question, you need to break down fiscal stress into its component parts, right? So fiscal stress, as we've defined it, can be kind of sort of reductively broken into two pieces. One is just the direct ability to raise revenue. And then the second would be sort of this underlying demand for municipal services. So levels of like distress within cities also can kind of contribute to fiscal stress, even if kind of tax revenues are remaining constant. So kind of underlying, we have two questions here. The first would be, how does population loss affect a city's ability to raise revenue? And then the second is, do cities shrink uniformly, or does population loss affect the socioeconomic composition of urban areas? And so just to kind of get a snapshot of what we're looking at, we created a panel data set of 110 of the largest cities in the country. And we're looking from 1980 to 2010 with data on the decennial census years. And so this is just showing percent change in population from 1980 to 2010. And you can see that population loss is relatively rare. So the cities where the bar is negative are cities that have lost population on net. But one thing to notice is that the red bars, the cities that are losing population, most of them are losing population chronically, right? So it's not just losing population for one decade and then growing again. They're losing population in consecutive decades. So this is sort of indicating potentially that fiscal stress is this chronic problem that begets future population loss. So just to run through a few hypotheses that we have, the first is that cities will lose population, will have lower fiscal capacity. So we'll have lower kind of ability to raise revenue directly. The second will be that fiscal capacity, and then this measure of social and economic distress will be inversely related. So as cities have higher levels of distress, they'll have lowered capacities to raise revenue to fund those services to address those levels of distress. And then lower levels of fiscal capacity and higher levels of distress will lead to further population loss. So this is kind of getting at that cycle of decline that it appears, just looking at how cities lose population seems to be occurring. And then so just to run through a couple empirical challenges when you're doing a study like this, the first being just measuring potential revenue, right? So what we want to get at is that observed revenue, just what cities are raising, is not necessarily the same as potential revenue, what cities can raise. So, I mean, as we all know that, actual tax revenue has two parts, the rate at which the city is taxing itself, and the base, what is being taxed. And so we want to look at, measure exclusively what the base, kind of the tax base in these declining cities are, or is. And then you kind of controlling for tax effort, or kind of controlling for the political decisions of kind of the level of taxation. And so to do this, we created this measure of potential revenue, which takes kind of estimates of tax bases. Most of these come on the far left column, come from the census. And we're applying standardized rates across our sample, right? So taking out that political decision of how, at what level to tax yourself. And then we can kind of get to this idea of total potential revenue if politics was held constant. So for example, we have aggregate property value from the census. We apply a standardized rate to all of the cities in our sample. We get a kind of an estimate of the owner-occupied city property tax revenue. Income, standardized rate, a potential, obviously not all cities have an income tax, but a potential income tax revenue. Rent by a cap rate by the property tax rate gives us rental property tax revenue potential. Sales tax, payroll, kind of get an estimate of corporate property tax. And then retail sales for kind of an estimate of potential retail sales tax revenue for cities. This gives us, a total potential revenue, and then we want to standardize it because obviously the cities in our sample vary quite significantly in size. We do this both by population, as I show here, and then we also use land. The reason we do this is obviously population is a relatively kind of common way to standardize things, but we're looking specifically at cities that lose population. So kind of we're building into our model potentially, if we just standardize by population, a shrinking denominator. So the population is shrinking by design in our model. So we also do it by land area. Land area in large cities obviously changes, but it changes at a slower rate. So it may be a little bit better standardization measure. And we also want to take kind of government wages, so labor costs into consideration. So this gives us our measure for our model of fiscal capacity, which can be seen as like the spending power and government labor of an average person's tax contribution. And just for 2007 for our data, the fiscal capacity ranged from about 1% to 6% with a mean of 3%. So the average citizen's tax contribution can pay between 1% and 6% of the average government salary. Quickly again, so we're looking at distress. So the other component of fiscal stress that we're looking at, just looking at expenditures is not maybe going to correlate exactly with underlying distress. So a city could be spending a little bit just because it has low demand for municipal services, or it could be spending a little bit because it just doesn't have, it's fiscally stressed, it doesn't have the capacity to pay for kind of the underlying demand. And so again, the goal is to create a standardized measure here. We use factor analysis looking for just common correlation and variables that we think are going to correlate with underlying distress. As John's talk before me really alluded to, poverty is a big one, right? So in all of our factor analyses, poverty is kind of the major kind of driving factor of our fiscal, or what we're calling distress. Poverty rates correlate with a lot of other things, and we think that's a pretty good estimate for what what distress looks like, what social and economic distress looks like in these cities. And so just, again, as an aside, the factor analysis, it kind of gives you a normal standardization. So our average is 0. And it ranges between about -1 and 1, 1 being more distress, -1 being less distress within our sample. And then again, a panel data set, I won't get into the data we use. It's in our paper if you want to take a look. So just starting, just some descriptive statistics. So these are sort of looking at the two components, or kind of potential correlates with the two components of fiscal stress. On the left, we have, density and vacancy, which we think would be sort of close to kind of abilities to raise revenue through the property tax. So cities in decline, the red bar, are losing density, right? Not surprising. Where cities that are growing are gaining density. And then vacancy rates in declining cities are much, much higher, or growing faster over this period. We're ending in 2010, so obviously vacancy rates were increasing across the country in central cities, but much, much faster in declining cities. And then if we're looking at some of our measures of distress, poverty and percent of the population that's black, it's increasing much faster in declining cities than growing. 46% versus 29%, and then 31 versus 18. And I don't have a slide for it, but we also look at crime rates, and crime rates are significantly higher and growing, or I guess actually declining slower in declining cities than they are in growing cities. So these cities look a lot different, kind of both from this measure of kind of fiscal capacity and then just sort of basic measures of distress. When we actually look at revenue, however, right, so again, this is broken up by decline and growth, they don't look that different, right? So if you look at per capita revenue in 2010, for declining and growing cities is exactly the same. Intergovernmental revenue is slightly higher in declining cities, so cities that are losing population have higher transfers from other levels of government. And expenditures are actually higher in per capita terms in declining cities. So this, again, that's sort of one of the motivations why we want to look at so these standardized measures of fiscal capacity and distress. So the population standardized, so dividing by population, you see kind of an increase in fiscal capacity in both declining and growing cities, but growing faster in growing cities. When we land standardize, so dividing by land area instead of population, you actually see a decline in declining cities. So this could be part of the fact that we're just controlling for the denominator, or controlling for a shrinking denominator in the population standardized group. And then one of the most stark differences, and this is something that's going to be kind of consistent throughout our results, is that distress is significantly higher in declining cities than it's growing. So of the fiscal, there does appear to be on both kind of measures of fiscal stress, differences between declining and growing cities, but that difference is much, much stronger in the distress component of fiscal stress. So just some simple kind of relationships here. This is distress against capacity. You see kind of that strong negative relationship that we'd expect, the inverse. As cities become more distressed, they seem to have lower fiscal capacities. Distress, population loss and distress, again, that negative relationship that we expect in a relatively strong one, right? So as cities gain more population, as population growth increases, our measures of decline decrease, or our measures of distress decrease. And then this is kind of a surprising result. So this is population loss against fiscal capacity. I believe this is population standardized fiscal capacity. And you see kind of a surprising result. So as cities are gaining more population, as population loss is increasing, we actually see a decline in fiscal capacity. And so what might be happening here? There are a few things. One is that cities with fast decline probably look more like cities in cities with fast growth probably look more like cities in decline than do the middle of the distribution. So on the far right, so cities that are growing really fast over this period are places like Las Vegas that have just been annexing like crazy and letting populations in. And then in the middle of the distribution, you have cities that have been growing slowly by instituting really restrictive growth controls, places like Boston and New York. They're selectively growing slow. They're making sure that the populations that they're letting in are people that can pay their way. So likely, the kind of the two ends of the distribution behave more similarly than the middle. And then similarly, within the middle, we have cities like Boston again, which is it's slow growth by design. And then we also have cities like Des Moines, which is just probably would naturally be falling in the middle of the distribution. It's just a city that is not crazy fast growth. It's not declining really quickly. It's just sort of chugging along. And I realize now I'm the first person to have a regression table, and for that I apologize. But I'll go over it quickly, and really kind of confirms the rest of our results today, or the results that I've kind of talked about to date. Basically, fiscal stress does seem to correlate with population loss, but it does so mostly through distress, right? So kind of this first regression, cities with population loss have lower levels of the distress index, or cities populations grow, their distress index declines. I'm just kind of interpreting our coefficients a little bit. A city that loses about 30% of its population over our study period is expected to have a distress of 0.38, relatively high. Again, it's standardized between with 1 and -1. Whereas a city that gains 40% of population, relatively fast growth, is expected, holding everything else in the model constant, to have a distress index of -0.4. And then again, if we look at fiscal capacity, it does appear that there is a relationship. It's a little difficult to kind of model. So in the third regression with the two underlined red lines, we see this is taking out, using kind of dummy variables, measuring cities with constant population loss, and then cities with fast growth, so over 40% population growth. And you see that then we both have like kind of negative coefficients on both of those. Kind of one of the estimates we have here is declining cities can pay for about 92 government employees per square mile of land. So that's our land standardized measure, where growing cities can pay for 165 employees, significantly different. Although cities with fast growth can only pay for 126. And then finally, kind of on the far right here, we see both fiscal capacity and distress correlate or associated with future population loss. So again, this is sort of reaffirming this cycle of decline that we've been seeing. And just so some quick conclusions, cities that consistently lose population exhibit higher levels of stress than do growing cities. So we see fiscal capacity does correlate with population loss, and it correlates mostly or most strongly kind of in the distress component of fiscal capacity. And then higher levels of distress correlate with lower levels of capacity. That kind of inverse relationship that we saw. The relationship between decline and capacity is mercy. So the fiscal capacity is a component of fiscal stress, is more difficult to measure. But all of this we think is pretty good evidence for a cycle of decline that's occurring in these cities where they're losing population. That I will thank you.
All right, not exactly uplifting, but I'm sure there could be some questions out there, and we do have some time to take on some questions or discussions. Does anybody have any thoughts that they'd like to share, or solutions? So, but Jerry?
Yeah, for John Bacheller, did you find any outliers, places that had high poverty and high performance?
No, at the bottom end, they were all very low. The only thing I would say is that I had a very small sample of charter schools, and when I looked at those, There were a few which you might be characterized as having something like what the KIPP schools use, which is a kind of a no excuses approaches that did better. In other words, maybe 20% better than might be expected. But even so, the poor performance of students at those was much less than you would see in, say, a good suburban school.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, yes, back there. Back in the back, in the side room. Patty?
Sorry. I sat in the no questions section. So Liz Davis from
Liz, hi.
OSC, and I had a couple questions. Well, one was for John Bacheller. I wanted to first of all say you need to. I mean, it's an obvious in some ways message, but it's one that has been not talked about, and that needs to go out more obviously. But I don't know. I know you had some suggestions for fixing, but I'm curious how you fix the problem of what is essentially a complete shift in the way society behaves and its effect on schools. Because, I know you're saying you can't just punish the schools into a change in society, but your changes were seemed like de minimis kind of changes that you were suggesting. I mean, other than not punishing the schools.
Poverty is a difficult, complex problem, and there aren't any easy answers, unfortunately. There are basically two things that you can do. One is that you can do more redistribution. And if you look at, for example, Europe, in Great Britain, they increased the amount of financial assistance to people who are poor, and it significantly reduced the percentage of people who are in poverty. So it works. It's also very difficult to sell politically. The other thing you need to think about is that there are a lot of obstacles to poor people getting jobs that start with low levels of education. Typically, in many cases, and you should look at the paper because there's a lot of demographic information about these people. A very high percentage are single-parent households. And so they are often people that have childcare challenges. They have difficult access to transportation because our transportation networks are designed to funnel people into the cities rather than from the cities out to where there might be work. And you have programs that often look at work or childcare, but not both together. So you have to think about really the issue as a systemic problem rather than a series of isolated silos. So I can't pretend that there's an answer for this, but I think if we don't focus on it, if we continue to ignore it, we're not going to do anything about it. We're going to continue to see the trend worsen.
I was wondering, Yunji, did your analysis showing the decline in state assistant include education aid, state aid to education?
Just looking at state aid to not school districts.
Not to school districts, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, there's another question. Liz, did you have another one?
I had a second question, actually,
Sure.
from this one for, and I'm sorry, it's Mildred Warner's.
That's me.
Yeah, you.
Yunji says.
So I had two questions just because we deal with this data a lot, and you had noted that real property taxes and expenditures had been flat over the decade, and in certainly in actual terms, I don't recall that. Is that in New York State, right?
Yes, this is in New York State, adjusted for inflation.
That's what I was going to ask. So it's
Yes.
adjusted for inflation. Okay. And what did you? The one other thing was, what did you mean when you said that 82 cents of every dollar was spent at the local level on education?
So we're taking, the way we're creating this decentralization index is we're taking total expenditures at the local level divided by state and local expenditure. And so that's the ratio we get there is 0.82.
So just to follow up on her question, does that mean that school aid is only about 18% of local expenditures on education? Yeah, I'm confused, I guess.
No.
Comment.
Or is the state
Yes.
for education that high? Hold on, that doesn't seem right either.
Here you go. There you go. I'm sorry. With regard to the property tax rise over the last decade, did you look at the official statements for bond offerings of municipalities in New York State? No. I'm going to send you a couple because they have doubled. Property tax levies have doubled over 10 years in every community in the state. I don't know where you come up with even on an inflation-adjusted basis, the property taxes have stayed flat. That's just not correct. So where did that data come from?
This is from the comptroller's office data.
The state controller?
Yes.
I'd like to see it because that's not the case at all. Property taxes have raised significantly in all communities throughout the state over the last decade.
Okay. Yes, John.
Another question from Ms. Kim. When you had a slide that showed expenditure patterns at the local level differentiated by the type of jurisdiction, and the one level of government that showed some change was counties. Did those expenditures and did the related state aid include Medicaid, which is an unusual local responsibility amongst all the states, and where structurally there have been very significant changes over the last half decade or decade?
Yes, they are included.
Thank you.
Okay. Dan, I was wondering, I mean, you talked about some of the, obviously the mismatch with the estimating fiscal stress and the mismatch between resources and problems that the cities are having to deal with. Does our state have anything to do with it, or the structure of sort of the local federalism structure of the relative responsibilities of the state and financing sources and financing various functions have any intervening effect on those relationships?
Quite likely. I mean, so is your question whether kind of for solutions, does the structure of state government kind of financial packages impact kind of what tools are available for local governments or for cities?
Yeah.
Yes,
I mean, does it affect this cycle that you're talking about? Or have you investigated that?
We haven't investigated that specifically. We don't look at differences between states, generally because we're looking at large cities, so...
Okay. Right. You don't have that
a
many
lot of states and only a few cities in our sample.
Right. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
I want to make a general comment. It's a little potentially radical, but I want it out there because I'd like the Rockefeller Institute to think about this. In the post-war era, with Robert Moses and the development of suburbs, there was a fleeing from the inner city to the suburbs, which became all white. And we are now reaping that harvest, which was so well documented, frighteningly documented, by John Bacheller. And it's got to national discussions like income inequality and the one percenters and that sort of thing. So here's an idea. I don't think government is the solution to this problem. I don't think government money is the solution to this problem. And the more government we throw in and the more government money we throw in, the poorer we're all going to become. The real problem, in my opinion, is that the people in the inner city don't have any connection with the people in the suburbs. They need to be mentored. They need to be looked after. They need to, if you want to talk about cooperation, it's cooperation in the metropolitan area between the rich in the suburbs and the poor in the city who are hungry to get out of the position that they're in. I know this personally from something I do completely outside of the practice of law. And until the guys who are going off and playing golf on the weekends stop doing that and go into the inner cities and start tutoring and start teaching people how to be financially responsible and encouraging them to get jobs, just teaching them how to look for a job and teaching them how to get along with people who live in their family, who live in their building. Until we do that, this problem is just going to take the country down. So I would like somebody to take a look at provide federal tax incentives. There's a structuring, there are economic incentives that can be created so that the people, and I'm retirement age, about retiring, but
Right.
there's a lot of guys who are living on pensions.
Right.
I'm not one of them, who have time and skills
Yeah.
that should be in the inner city. And I'm not talking about not-for-profits and do-gooders,
Right.
but actually taking on families and buildings and
Yeah.
blocks and teaching those people how to live like normal, civilized people. And if you think what happened in Paris this weekend is not coming here, it is if we don't get to this inner city problem.
Well, you're right, that's radical. No, it's very interesting because, there are a number of programs, they're sort of mixed governmental, private, sometimes more private, community-based programs that, like Promised Neighborhoods, or our chancellor's been working on cradle-to-career efforts, both in Cincinnati and now in Albany and other places. But they're all grounded in the particular neighborhood with stakeholders within that neighborhood, and so they're more homogeneous and really not bringing these connecting different communities of different economic levels together. And that is interesting. We talk about public-private partnerships, but not necessarily community-community private partnerships with very different levels of fiscal capability. So it's
Getting out of the gated communities and going back into
Right.
the cities. That needs to be incentivized and needs to be made a thing that we do,
Right.
as opposed to running away from the cities and holing up in our gated communities, because that's not working anymore.
No, it's a fascinating idea. So, anybody else? Pardon me? You think it's okay? Bob says he thinks it's time to close, and Bob is always right. So I would really like to thank our staff. I would like to thank Bob Bullock. I would like to thank Patty Cadret. Joe Chamberlain's back there. Michelle Charbonneau has been working away on things, and Mike Cooper has been, also at the Institute, has been great. And I also just want to give a hand to Mike Hattery for organizing, for going through people's papers, for thinking this all through. And this has been a wonderful event, and we will do it again. So it's great to start putting this community of researchers and thinkers and people who with public and private responsibilities together. So thank you all.